It was a plane at the forefront of military aviation, a bold and authoritative step into the Cold War, into historically unforgettable flirtation with the sound barrier itself. From its first flight for His Majesty in 1951 to its continued service in at least one global air force today, the British-made Hawker Hunter has been an icon of military aviation for 7 decades running. And with nearly 2,000 of the planes produced, they made an indelible impact in the skies for every air force that they served. The Hawker Hunter was a major technological innovation. It was a true record breaker, and it goes down alongside the MiG-15, the F-16, and the F-22 as one of the most famous jet fighters in all of history. Today's video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the thrilling online PvP strategy game that will keep you absolutely on the edge of your seat. Picture this: World War II military strategies in an epic battle for supremacy. That's what you'll find in Conflict of Nations. Choose a real country and lead it to victory in a modern global war. Fight against up to 128 other players in real-time matches that can last for weeks. Use a wide array of units to build your unstoppable army. From tanks to jets, even nuclear submarines, the possibilities are endless. Ready to dominate the world? Declare war on your neighbors, or forge alliances with other players. The choice is yours. Plan your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and watch as your empire expands. One aspect that I love about Conflict of Nations is the long-term strategy that it offers. It's not just about quick battles, it's about carefully planning your moves and outsmarting your opponents. And the best part, you can play Conflict of Nations on both PC and mobile with the same account. But there's more. Click the link in the description to receive an exclusive gift. You'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Don't miss out on this limited time offer, only available for 30 days. And now back to today's video. When Nazi Germany put their Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter into the sky, they set off a new era in aerial combat. The jet age, in which aircraft powered by turbojet engines could reach greater speeds and show far better performance in the skies than a propeller plane could ever dream of. It wasn't just a combat innovation, it was a goddamn rocket. And even after the Nazi state was overrun, the world understood that those who controlled jet technology controlled the airspace. But the first generation of jet fighters was a hell of an experiment, with results that didn't always turn out very well, and every country who tried to get in on the action learned some pretty difficult lessons in the process. The United Kingdom was no different, except perhaps that their first lesson didn't come by way of design failures or dangerous technology. Instead, it came through inaction. After the end of World War II, the new parliament under Prime Minister Clement Attlee assessed that there would be no new major conflicts around the world for at least a decade, meaning that Britain had time to lick its wounds after the war and fix its inventory without having to invest in new technologies. The UK's jet fighter at the time, the Gloucester Meteor, was an advanced aircraft when it entered production in 1943, but it was left in the dust after World War II. But unlike the Americans and the Soviets, the Brits didn't really seem very interested in dealing with this issue promptly. This approach left the government unprepared for the start of the Cold War, and although one plane, the Hawker Seahawk, was able to enter development in that time, the Seahawk alone was ill-prepared to combat an onslaught of Soviet fighters if an all-out war were to begin. Between its straight-wing design and its outdated jet engine, the Seahawk was on the verge of obsolescence not long after it was produced, and although plenty of aircraft designers presented a potential alternative to the government, Parliament continued to drag its feet on adopting a truly airworthy jet fighter. But by 1948, the British had figured out that they were behind in a new arms race. The government had already released a request for a daytime jet-powered interceptor in 1946, but 2 years later, they clarified what precisely they were looking for. A speed of 629 miles per hour, 1,010 kilometers per hour at 45,000 feet, with a high rate of climb and the ability to carry several low-caliber cannons. Hawker, the same company that had produced the Seahawk, had already been attempting to solicit interest from Parliament on a replacement design, one that featured swept wings and a more powerful engine. But led by chief designer Sidney Camp, Hawker was able to pivot quickly in response to the Air Ministry's more precise specifications. During the first 18 months of design, Cam and his team focused on a few basic issues: figuring out the best possible tail arrangement for a faster jet plane and moving twin air intakes to the wing roots. But when the Korean War broke out in 1950, Australian airmen flying British-made Gloster Meteors proved to be no match for the Soviet-made MiG-15. So the Air Ministry was forced to face their own severe deficits in air power. The hesitant complacency of 1946 and 1947 was now replaced by desperation. And although the Air Ministry made it clear that they were looking for a long-term contract eventually, they also announced that they'd be very interested in getting a short-term fighter as soon as possible. So intense was the pressure that the Air Ministry accepted 2 designs, even despite there being no prototype available. They were quite literally just designs, just ideas. One of them was the Hawker design, and the other was from the Supermarine company, whose Spitfire plane had become an icon of the Second World War. The British hoped that at least one of these 2 companies would be able to produce a halfway decent aircraft, something they could put in the skies just as a temporary stopgap in order to slow down the communist advance in Korea. The Air Ministry ordered 400 of Hawker's aircraft, with half of them to be powered by an engine manufactured by Avon Company and the other half with an engine by Sapphire Company. By the start of 1951, the prototype version of the plane, dubbed the P-1067, made its first flight, and the second prototype, which was fitted out with all of the avionics and armament that would be included in a production line model, flew in mid-1952. By 1953, the production model Hunter F1 was ready to make its first flight, and after a handful of pre-production models got churned out with their own various design tweaks, the plane went into assembly line production. Although the bulk of the Korean War had already passed, the Hunter appeared to be a promising design. It even broke the airspeed record for a jet aircraft at the time, flying at a speed of 727 miles per hour, just below the sound barrier. And although the Supermarine Swift would break that record shortly afterward, it was the Hawker Hunter that would enter service with the Royal Air Force, while the Swift was cancelled 2 years later. Now, the Hunter F1 was in many ways a major innovation, but it wasn't perfect. 139 copies of the F1 version were produced, powered by the Avon engine that we mentioned earlier, and 45 copies of the F2 version, powered by the Sapphire engine, joined them in the skies as well. But both versions of the fighter had a whole suite of issues, not least the fact that the damn thing had no air brake. Pilots had no way to slow the plane down other than using their wing flaps, which was not a reliable way of rapidly decelerating any advanced plane of that time, let alone a fast, nimble fighter jet that would have to decelerate in combat conditions. The Avon engine also had the tendency to surge, specifically when the plane's guns fired, and the gases issued by the guns found their way into the engine. Temporarily, pilots had to slow down their planes in order to fire their guns, and they didn't just slow it down a little bit. If the F1 traveled faster than 275 miles per hour or flew above 25,000 feet, it couldn't fire its guns without a surge. Finally, the plane had very limited range, so bad in fact that in 1956, 6 of the planes were lost during a training exercise when they exhausted their fuel. One pilot died in the incident. And look, quite frankly, the plane was an embarrassment. It was still better than the Supermarine Swift, but that didn't mean it was good, and the UK did its best to cover up that difficult reality. However, all these issues were eventually resolved, an air brake was installed, the engines were modified, and the F1 fighters received additional fuel tanks and hardpoints. All of these changes were enough to require a code change for the new fighters, with new production line models designated the Hunter F4. The F4 had a much better fuel capacity and a stronger and more reliable engine, and when it first took to the skies in 1954, well after the Korean War had ended, it was seen as a significant improvement on the F1 and F2 versions. It also fixed another problem those prior designs had, specifically that ejected ammunition links tended to smash against the plane's underbelly. The F4 was tweaked to include a modified exhaust chute, and 349 of the planes would eventually enter service. Then there was the F5, which still used engines produced by the Sapphire Company. It too flew later in 1954 with basically the same other features as the F4, and a total of 105 were produced. But the ultimate version of the Hawker Hunter was the F6, which first entered service in 1956 and would eventually become the pride of the Royal Air Force. The F6 was no longer a reaction to the catastrophic design flaws of the earlier versions, but instead it was a significant improvement on their overall capacities based on newly available technology. The F6 used a far more powerful Avon engine than any prior model. It had space for 4 external fuel drop tanks, and it had modifications to the leading edges of its wings called sawtooth wings, which solved the tendency for the plane to pitch upward when it experienced high G-forces at high speeds and altitude. The F6 also received a gun camera mounted in the nose, a gun-laying radar with automatic range finding, and the option to mount several different kinds of weapons on its external hardpoints. It was the F-6 that would be fully adopted by the Royal Air Force, with 384 of the planes built in total. And although it spawned a long line of variants that we're going to discuss shortly, of course, the F-6 remained the base design for the Hawker Hunter for the rest of its service life. So as such, let's dig into the specs, shall we? At sea level, the Hunter F-6 was capable of flying at a top speed of 715 miles per hour, 94% of the way to the sound barrier, while at altitude, it could fly well over 600 miles per hour. The Hunter had a service ceiling of 50,000 feet and could make the climb in under 3 minutes, with a climb rate of nearly 300 feet per second. With a single-seat cockpit, the Hunter boasted a back-swept wingspan of 33 feet wide compared to a length of 45 feet and an empty weight of just over 7 tons. Although it had a combat range of only 385 miles, the use of external fuel hardpoints allowed it to fly for 1,900 miles at maximum. It featured a removable gun pack that carried 4 30mm revolver cannons, with 4 underwing hardpoints that could carry up to 72 rockets, air-to-air or air-to-surface missiles, bombs, or additional, even larger drop tanks. The Hawker Hurricane was thus faster, better armed, and had a far superior climb rate to the Soviet MiG-15 and MiG-17 and the American F-86 Sabre. The Hawker Hunter was sent to the front lines for the first time in 1956, where 2 squadrons based in Cyprus were used as escorts for British medium bombers during the Suez Crisis. A few years later, Hunters would see action in Brunei, where they would strafe rebels on the ground and provide overwatch. They flew in Yemen during the Aden emergency, and they were dispatched in close air support roles to British bases and detachments worldwide. But since the Hunter had arrived a bit too late for the Korean War, it essentially missed its chance to get in on a major conflict. In fact, this is the part of the story where things get a bit anticlimactic. Although the Hunter served valiantly in ground attack roles, it very rarely served in its intended interceptor role with the Royal Air Force, and by the time hostilities picked up again, it had been replaced as a fighter aircraft by the English Electric Lightning. Since the Lightning could fly at over twice the speed of sound, it was immediately seen as the more appropriate aircraft for an interceptor role. After they were replaced in their aerial combat role, many of the Hunter aircraft transitioned into service with the Royal Air Force's display units, the Black Arrows and the Blue Diamonds. The Black Arrows would perform record-breaking maneuvers with the Hunters, including an instance in which they coordinated 22 Hunters to perform loops and barrel rolls in formation. Other Hunters would be sent to serve as training aircraft, with 2-seat trainer planes developed as their own separate variants. But the majority would be converted into the FGA-9 ground attack variant, featuring a suite of modifications that made them appropriate to strafe or launch rockets at ground targets at the expense of dogfight ability. A couple of reconnaissance versions also took to the skies, but by and large, the Hawker Hunter service with the RAF was beginning to wind down. Except, it wasn't quite that simple, because in addition to the many variants produced for the Royal Air Force, the Hawker Hurricane got to have a second career as a stunningly popular export plane all around the world. Over 40 individual variants of the Hunter would be produced for various international customers, including Sweden, India, Denmark, Singapore, and well over a dozen other nations around the world. Although the British versions of the Hunter would never see the sort of large-scale service against comparable aircraft that the UK expected, they'd definitely get their shot in other air forces around the world, where they held up admirably in their roles for which they were built. By the time of the Sino-Indian War, India had acquired 140 of the Hunter fighters, which were its most dangerous and powerful fighter aircraft. Going up against Soviet-supplied MiG fighters, the Hunters proved their clear superiority, and it was due to the threat of the Hunter that Chinese bombers weren't able to make significant attack runs on large-scale targets in India. In the Indo-Pakistani War of 1956, the Hunter again took on a central dogfighting role, where it was able to stalemate a Pakistani air fleet of American-made F-86 and F-104 fighters. When hostilities broke out again in 1971, a group of 6 Hunters were able to continually bombard a Pakistani infantry and armor column and eventually force them to retreat, and other Hunters took on the responsibility of ground attacks toward Pakistani targets. In each of these conflicts, the Hunter showed itself to be as good as, or even better than, American and Soviet fighter planes. Other fighters saw combat in Lebanon as recently as 2014, when they were permanently retired from service after a short return to work in 2007, and the Hunter became the focal aircraft of Switzerland and Singapore's own aerobatics teams. Believe it or not, Zimbabwe still had Hunters in service in 2022, a full 7 decades after the Hunter F-1 first flew. So, on the one hand, the Hawker Hunter was the right plane, but at the wrong time. It was built for service in Korea, but missed the conflict completely. And the years it spent in British service, while certainly not quiet, didn't include any large-scale conflicts that would have required the Hunter's particular set of skills. But as its deployment with otherworld militaries has shown, the Hunter's design was cutting edge for its time, more than capable of holding its own against American fighter aircraft, and outright superior to many of the Soviet fighter planes of the day. In an era desperate for a plane that could take jet fighter technology from the experimental stage and really prove what it could do, it was the Hawker Hunter that answered the call as one of the most iconic British fighter jets ever produced. Just a reminder that today's video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, and it's your ticket to an exhilarating free PvP strategy game set in modern global warfare. Choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. Play Conflict of Nations for free on PC, iOS, or Android. And don't forget, you can claim your exclusive glyph by clicking the link in the description below. Get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. But remember, it's only valid for 30 days, and I'll see you next time.